This is the 31st episode of the Psychology Podcast. I am your host, Daniel Karim, and I hope you will find something useful in my conversation with this world-leading expert. Nadine, welcome to the 31st episode of the Psychology Podcast with me. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Nervous. I think you're the most famous person that has appeared on my podcast so far. So excuse me if I babble a bit more nonsense than usual.
That's okay.
Where in the world are you right now?
I'm in Florida. I'm in Boca Raton.
I'm so jealous. In Germany is a big storm over my city right now. So if you hear any birds or trees falling against my window, I am not doing it on purpose. We are not blessed with the good weather like the Floridians.
Okay. Right, 75 and sunny.
Oh, I'm great. The purpose of this podcast is to find extraordinary people and people who I admire and go on a journey, on a conversational journey together with them in order to figure out how they became that person. I think you qualify for that. Many people over the world know you, and you have helped people with some of the darkest issues individuals can have. So I would like to dedicate the first segment of this podcast to finding out who you are and allowing you to introduce yourself to the media, because I'm sure that if I do this for you, I will butcher it right away. So who are you? If people ask you what you do, Nadine, what do you say to them?
Well, I am first and foremost a mother, right? That's the most important job anybody can do. I have 2 beautiful children and 3 stepchildren, so I have a lot of kids. But they're old now and they don't need me. So now I'm a therapist. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in the States. And I also have my PhD in somatic psychotherapy, which is a very fancy way for saying that I utilize the mind-body connection in therapy.
What was the first sign for you that you would become a therapist?
Well, I was raised by a single mother in Brooklyn in the 1970s, and I was very blessed because she was obsessed with Carl Jung and Freud and Carl Rogers. And so she was always talking to me about psychology. And she would often ask me, do you think it's nature or nurture that shapes a person? And I was like, Mom, I'm 10. But she planted those seeds in my brain for psychology. And we always spoke about our feelings. And so psychology was always a very important part of our lives. And I was very lucky in that way. And then I grew up in Brooklyn, and then I was modeling in New York City. And as the movie shows, my ex-husband is the Wolf of Wallstreet, Jordan Belfort. And I went to a party with a boyfriend at the time. And I guess Jordan Belfort saw me, as it shows in the movie, and he pursued me. And so I was 22, he was 28 years old. And we dated. It was fast and furious. We got married a year later, I think, as crazy as that sounds. And I would say like a year and a half into our relationship, he had to get a back surgery, and he took too many pills after the back surgery. And so he went to rehab for the weekend. And I happened to be pregnant, and I went to his therapist because I wanted to find out about him. I was like, what's going on with this guy I married? Why did he do this? And his therapist was lovely. And he said, when Jordan works, he's like a symphony. But when he doesn't, he's a natural disaster. Your time's up. And I was like, what? And so at that moment, I decided I needed to get into therapy because I realized that my life, I was 25 at this point, was more than I could handle. Being married to this man was going to be more than I could manage on my own. So I went to therapy.
I actually wrote down a couple of questions that I would like to discuss with you.
Sure.
For that segment of your life.
Yeah.
But later. Right now, I'm very much interested in the earlier part of your autobiography, because like you, like I grew up in a neighborhood that was impoverished, and we didn't have a lot, but my mother was always obsessed with books. And even though we didn't have a lot, it's like I basically grew up in a library, and I'm very interested about what's the biggest lesson you learned from your mother, and what was it like for you to grow up in Brooklyn, in that environment for you. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, Brooklyn in the 70s was amazing. There wasn't the internet. Kids played on the street all day. It didn't matter that we didn't have money because nobody had money.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of fun. And my mother was an amazing, amazing single mother. And she taught me, I mean, oh my God, I can't even imagine. I mean, I wouldn't be the person I am, you know, all that I am or all that I hope to be, I owe to her. She's
Mhm.
deceased. But my mom, I think she really pushed me into education because I was born naturally pretty. I mean, like we're born the way we're born. You know, I really didn't have anything to do with it. And I didn't know I was pretty because until people told me that as a young girl, I didn't even know what that meant.
Yeah.
But she was very steadfast in her determination to make sure that I got educated. And I don't think I really valued that at that time, but it was obviously it's instilled in me now that I have my doctorate. And I'm very grateful to her for that because I think she taught me that, you know, people can strip everything of you, but they can't take your education.
Yeah. My mom always used to say that wealth is what you have when you lose all your money, in a way,
Right,
making a strong emphasis on character and virtues in
right,
particular.
right. And my mother was very relational, and relationships were what mattered to her.
Mm,
Our
interesting.
relationship, my relationship with her, my relationship with my brother.
Yeah.
Yeah,
One of the things I would like to ask, you don't have to answer that. It's I also grew up. My father returned to our family later in life when I was like
yeah,
17, and it's strange, but the absence of him played almost as big an impact on my upbringing as the presence of my mother. So I would like to
yeah,
ask you, like, how did that shape you into who you become later? Because I have the utmost respect for single mothers,
yeah,
but it's difficult to be two persons in
yeah.
one, right? Could you share a little
Yeah,
bit of your thoughts about that?
yeah, I actually think I was very blessed that my father wasn't around. My father was not, he's a gorgeous man, he's charming, but he's a gambling addict. And that my parents
Oh.
got divorced when I was 6. But I think that my mother had grown up in a very dysfunctional home because of her father. And I think I grew up in a very, very peaceful home because there
Mm.
wasn't a man there. And nothing against men. I love men. I'm married. I have a son. But I think actually, I mean, of course, it shaped me in a way that I think I was longing to feel secure from a man because I think the father does represent that. But I think in a way, it allowed my home to be very peaceful. There was no
Mm.
yelling, there was no
Mm.
hitting, there
Mm.
was nothing like that. It
Mm.
was really lovely.
My father was a gambling addict also.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, actually, one of the reasons why I am currently creating what's called the Behavior University. It's an online university for people who want to work on their character with technologies and online tools. And I started to focus on behavior because I wanted to figure out, like, I still have this image of my mind of my father in front of this one-armed bandit. And my
Oh,
father's a, yeah, my father's a tough guy. Like, he served in war, and it was so strange to me that there are machines that can break even the toughest of men. And I was always interested, like, what makes us do things and how come that certain people are able to resist temptations and other people fall prey to it. One of the questions I also would like to ask you is, a big part of your life has been, that may be like an overgress, addiction of people you have been connected with, right?
mhm. Yeah.
When was the first time you met an addict in your life that had an impact on you for negative consequences, if
Oh,
that question
that
makes
was
any sense?
definitely my ex-husband. You
Mm-hmm.
know, when I was growing up, like I said, my father didn't live with me, so I really didn't know he was a gambling addict.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that till much, much later. So I had never faced with or dealt addiction till I met my ex-husband.
Okay.
Yeah, he was
Okay.
my first
Again,
option.
let's move this a little bit forward because I think that's such an interesting section of the interview. I would like
Yeah.
to deconstruct it with you in patience.
Mhm.
Are there any particular setbacks, Nadine, that you struggled in your upbringing or your early adolescence that later shaped you to become the person that you are today? Do you have maybe a
Any
story?
setbacks? Yeah, I
Yeah.
think um, a setback was my mother's, like, let's say, lack of resources for sure,
Mm.
because we have 3 needs as adults. We need to feel confident, we need to have healthy relatedness, and we need to have a sense of autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when my mother, could have control over me till I became a teenager. I would focus in school and do well in school. And then I think once, I was a teenager and I realized I could have my individuality, I was like, oh, but I'm not going to listen to you, Mom. And, society really, teaches you to focus on the way you look. And I think because I was attractive, that got very much into that. And also, basically, because my parents left, I was supporting myself on my own at 17 financially. And then it's very expensive to live in New York City, as you can imagine. Then I became a model. And so then my career was wrapped up in that. So
Yeah.
I think it really set me up to become an object for my ex-husband in our life.
Yeah. That was one of the things that I was thinking about is the effects that beauty has on people. Because, for example, when I grew up, like it's like nobody cared how I look. It was always important, like who I am and what I delivered and what
Right.
contributions I could. And I always thought it was strange if I would have been born like a beautiful woman. Okay, that's a very strange sentence, but the idea
Yeah.
behind it,
No,
like
no, it's
the
not.
path that would have been delivered to me would be to focus more on my outer looks instead of what I look on the inside. And I always
Right.
wanted to ask you is, what was it like for you to be a world famous model, and has there been some downsides to pursuing that path? Because I believe there's always
Yeah.
good and bad
Yeah.
things about everything.
Listen, I think that really I became a model strictly to make money. So it was boring. It's not fun to compete with other people based upon what you look like. There wasn't Instagram back then or social media. So really it was a very tough job to, go against these beautiful women and get rejected, 100 times a week. But it really was to
Yeah.
make money. It really
Yeah.
was to make money. But I think what happens is that in our society, we're so focused on that. And honestly, I didn't really understand it. But I was like, oh, I guess this is a big deal. I'm pretty, And then I needed it to make money. And then luckily, though, I did have a parent that was very involved with what type of person I was and my education and what type of person I was on the inside. And I think that if I wouldn't have had that initial seeds of that, my life would have gone very wrong.
Interesting. You went to school back when you were 38.
Yeah.
Small shift. I think
Mhm.
it's amazing. I think because there are so many people who run around with beliefs. It's too late for me to start this. It's too late to me to find that person. It's too late for me to, I don't
Right.
know, start that one business. And I just love that you added that to your story on your
Mhm.
website, because I think it shows humility, it shows faith, and it
Yes.
shows that their dreams don't have a clock, and that it's always better to pursue something late than never. Could you tell a little bit of that decision? Because I feel that a lot of people who are as successful as you, they are too proud to go that backstep and adopt that identity
Oh,
of
yeah.
I'm a student again, because they have
Right.
problems with that. Still, tell us
Right.
that story, please.
Yeah. I was, after I left my ex-husband, I was in the garment business for many years. And I enjoyed that business and I was good at that as well. But there was an ageism to it and fashion and being trendy. And I knew I didn't want that. And I started to meditate around that time, as we do in Los Angeles, because it's the land of meditation. And it just came my meditation. I'm going to go back to school to be a therapist because I believe that therapy had saved my life. And I really wanted to be of service. And I love to learn. And I'm not, like you said, there is a humility to it, but that's okay because I just went back with a beginner's mind and, the time was going to go by anyway. And I figured that let me put my attention to something that I feel like is very meaningful for my life because my kids were going to leave, eventually, and they do. And so it was, and my husband was very supportive. And then I loved school. So then I got my master's and then I was like, oh, I'm just going to keep going.
isn't it strange that how much our early caretakers influence us later? Because one of the things that I heard was the story you told earlier is how your mother installed with you
Yep.
passion for learning, right? And it's one of the next sections that I would like to talk with you is a little bit about the darker aspects of psychology, because I think
Mhm.
through your education, through your ex-marriage, but also through your experience as a therapist, you have become an expert at narcissistic abuse, at
Mhm.
trauma bonding, but also at spotting malevolent individuals from afar. And one of the
Yeah.
things that I hear is I hear a lot of my mother in you, because my mother grew up without a father, and my father had psychopathic tendencies and
Yeah.
narcissistic tendencies, and she
Yeah.
did not have what I call like defense against the dark arts, because there wasn't a
Right.
father in the household who would tell you this is how you spot the bad guys, this is how
Right.
you recover from them. So I would like to dedicate the next segment in order to share our experiences here a little bit, in order to provide people who maybe aren't as obsessed about psychology as you and I, to provide them with a couple of,
Right.
yeah, because not everybody may. Some people are do
No,
different
I
things.
mean, thank God the whole world go crazy, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I have to ask this question. Is your marriage with Jordan Belfort has been portrayed in the movie The Wolf of Wall Street. And it's, I honestly don't know anybody who hasn't watched that movie.
I know.
which,
No, me
which,
neither.
this is really strange, because I tried to Google how many views that movie has, and it just didn't show up. So it feels like just everybody watched that movie. What was that
Yeah.
experience for you like to see that movie on screen, and what's the story behind your involvement in that? Because I think that's an experience that only maybe one or two people in the world can share,
Right.
and you're one of them.
Yeah. I mean, just like everything, it was paradoxical. It had good and bad things about it. I mean, initially Jordan had written a book. And so he wrote the book when he was in jail, and I read the book, and I wanted to kill him. I threw it on the floor. I'm very dramatic. And I cried and threw myself in bed. And for 5 hours, my husband's like, okay, you have to get up. And I called him up and I was like, why did you write that? Like half of it wasn't true. And he's like, I wrote it because it makes a good story. I mean, and some of it, of course, was true. And I was angry about it because it was very painful, my marriage with him. I always looked at it as a Greek tragedy. And I had spent so much time getting over it. And I just felt like him writing the book that then got made into a movie was the ultimate form of gaslighting.
Yeah.
Because it was really
Could you
horrible.
tell people what gaslighting is? Because
Yeah, gaslighting is where somebody in the movie, he portrays me as throwing water in his face, which I never did. I mean, I should have. And that I was always getting angry at him about other women, which I never did. I'm not a jealous person. I got angry at him about his drug addiction. And so for him to portray me getting angry at him all the time about women was gaslighting him, because was gaslighting in the sense that he like wiped out my reality, and it was only filled with his perception.
Which is interesting in itself, right? Because it's like I saw the movie, and I remember after our first conversation, I was like, that's not Nadine in the movie at all. Like it's and that's very interesting, because now that you shared with me a little about the psychoanatomy of your ex-husband, it's interesting like what story was in his mind. Because one of the things that I learned from my father was as a narcissist or a psychopath, they're always so delusional in their story, right?
Yeah.
And that was interesting that come out of you.
I mean, and they want to control the narrative at the end of the day, right? And so, but then, it was going to be made into a movie. And at that point, I'd done a lot of work on myself. And I said, I'm going to surrender into this process. This is bigger than me. And really, I was mostly concerned about my children. And so for the book, they could use my name. And then I told Jordan, they're not using my name in the movie. And he's like, why? And I said, no, I have no creative input. It's not my perspective. I've been down this road before. They're not using my name. I mean, people will find out it's me, but I'm taking a stance. And so then Martin Scorsese's office called me, and they said, oh, we hear you don't want to use your name. And I said, well, it's about time you called me. You're making a fucking movie about my life. And I said, I was pissed. And so they called me and they said, well, but whatever they said. And I said, listen, I don't care about me. I care about my kids. They're the ones that I really care about. I'm a 40-year-old woman, care about my children. They're always my first concern. And they were very lovely. And they said, Margot wants to meet you. And I said, okay. And I flew to New York to take my daughter to college. And then I got to meet the girl who was going to portray me in the movie that night. So that was a strange experience, but Margot was lovely and they wanted my accent because I have a crazy accent, as you can hear.
You do?
And I do. Yeah, I think so. And so it went very well. And when the movie came out, you know, it's a very surreal process, right? Because luckily I had done so much work on myself that I could surrender and let go, because I had no control. And that was my only choice. And Paramount sent my husband and I to see a private screening. And I watched the movie and it was funny. And at the end, I was like, you know what? It was okay. Of course, it didn't show me my depth of character, but that's okay. It was his story. I just was like a pretty girl who was a good mother who tolerated a crazy person, which is really the truth. And I was okay with it. At that point, I was okay with it. And my kids were okay with it. Luckily, I had spoken with them so much about our old life. And the interesting part, though, is that right around that time was when I was getting licensed to be a therapist. And I was like, oh my God, everybody is going to look me up. What are they going to think? And so I say this to your listeners, don't worry about that stuff, because all the stuff you worry about never matters. Yeah. In fact, when people did Google me, they were like, wait, you went through that and you came out like this? Yeah. We're going to come see you. So the very thing I worried about actually was the opposite. Mm-hmm. And it's allowed me to, the interesting thing is I was mad at Jordan and he looked at me and he said, you have $100 million campaign to do with whatever you want now. And I said, okay. But the ironic thing is that now as I'm starting to do it, he gets mad. Mm. And I'm like, but wait, you told me that.
Yeah.
You just underestimated me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And all I want to do is help people grow.
Yeah. Well, Nietzsche once said you can determine a person's character by how much truth they can tolerate.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, it's one of the
I'm going to write that one down. You can see a person's character by how much truth. Okay.
Yeah, because one of the things that I notice when I work with malevolent or psychopathic individuals, or even like most of the times it's their partners who come to me and they want to figure out, am I in an abusive relationship? Because you can't see straight when you're in it. And one of the things that I always look for is to what degree can this person tolerate criticism? Do you have to work on eggshells? And so next question for you would also be, it must be strange to see Leonardo DiCaprio portray your ex-husband in their movies. So what do you feel, what was that like for you? Did he get, that was been strange, right? I mean, what was that like for you?
That was the least of it. I mean, I can really, I'm not a celebrity person at all. I could give a shit about Leonardo DiCaprio, no offense. He's a human like I'm a human. I don't judge people about whether they're celebrities or not.
Yeah.
Like, I don't judge people in general. I mean, I just look at all of us as we're not better, we're not worse. We're just in the middle. We're just human. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's kind of funny because my ex-husband's 5'7", Leo's 6'1". But that didn't really faze me that much. The bigger pill to swallow was my perception getting wiped out. But again, it wasn't my movie, it wasn't my book, and that's okay because it was his story.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, life works in strange ways, right? It's like, who knows, like how many more people you can help because you went through the story, right?
Right.
One of the things that I would like to ask you about is your book, Trauma Bonds, because I feel that you have a unique perspective on this. And one of the things I always try to figure out is, what are the materials, the tactics, the philosophies, the tips that we can give to people who were, for example, in your shoes before you married Belfort, that could have helped them to make better decisions that were aligned with the best of them?
Yeah, So and I'm glad you asked that question. So here's the thing, is that I'm 54, so I met my ex-husband when I was 23. It's 30 years ago, right? There were no terms, trauma bonds. Nobody talked about narcissists. Nobody talked about the dark tetrad. So I was really in the dark.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody, not even therapists really spoke about it. Okay.
Literally in the dark.
Literally, right. Literally in the dark world. And so the things to look out for with somebody like that is boundaries. You know, I didn't want kids right away. I didn't want to get married right away, but my ex-husband wouldn't tolerate that. A dark tetrad or a narcissistic person, they'll plow through your boundaries. Mm-hmm. You will not be able to have healthy boundaries, which we should all be able to. Yeah. And I really couldn't have any needs. It was all about him. Mm-hmm. It was, and I was kind of used to that growing up with a single mom. And so it was a place that I fell easily into. Mm-hmm. But I really, and he was just super self-absorbed, couldn't hear me. If somebody can't hear you, they can't love you. Mm. And his rage, if somebody gets that mad all the time over nothing, leave. Mm-hmm.
Nadine, your mother taught you about Freud and Jung. And one of the things that I learned from the psychoanalytic thinkers that transformed everything in regards to me of how I see the human condition was that a human being is not the master in his own house, and that we are more like that there are different entities within us, like emotional systems that are autonomous to some degree.
Yes.
If you would write like a dictionary entry for, I like to use the word evil. Not most of my peers like to use that word. I don't know what you would like to use, but if you would write it like a dictionary entry for individuals like that, what would that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, what that would look like is that an evil person or a malevolent person or a socially aversive or harmful person, they will use and exploit you for their own needs for power, pleasure, status, and money. That's the first part. The second part is that they will justify using you as a utility belt. They will justify it for revenge. They will justify it to say that everyone is like that. And they will justify it by saying, I'm superior, I'm entitled to that, and I'm worth it.
I just got goosebumps because I thought a lot about like my own history and had a couple of moments in that regard that came up. One of
and
the
that's
things that
actually, I just want to give credit to that. That's actually from a research paper that I've read that I have in my book, and we actually call it the D factor.
What's that like?
So the D factor is that part, is that what I said, like the first part and then the second part. It's the malevolent, it's the need to have your own, it's the desire to have your own needs for power and pleasure met by using exploiting people, but also the justification.
Yeah. It's also the absence of truth in a manner, I feel.
Yes.
It's what did you notice about, you have to stop me at any point if I ask questions that you're not comfortable with, but one of the questions that I feel that I'm interested in is, what is the psychic anatomy of individuals like that, and what's at the bottom of those things? So question for me is, what was Belfort's relationship with his conscience, for example? Because one of the things that I noticed with my father, for example, and he had his great sides and I love him, but there were some darker aspects of his personality, was that he was able to tell himself whatever he wanted to believe that served his narrative, even though it was obvious that this wasn't the truth in the matter. And it's particularly the absence of consulting his conscience that I found was responsible for him deviating from his potential. And I wanted to ask you your take, and from your experience, what do you feel was the role of his conscience?
I think that people that are personality, so a dark tetrad person has probably 1 or 3 personality disorders, okay? Then aside from a personality disorder, they probably have a mood disorder, probably like anxiety, depression, or bipolar disorder, okay? They also have impulsivity issues, meaning they can't control their impulses, right? And the other thing is they usually have some compulsive behaviors, whether it's with sex or gambling or food. So we see how complex their personality organization is. And somebody with a complex personality organization like that, they don't think that what they're doing is wrong. Because it's egocentric, meaning if you or I feel anxious or depressed, I'm like, oh, I'm anxious, I'm depressed, I need to do something. Personality structure, when it's dysfunctional, is who a person is. It's how they behave, it's how they think, it's how they feel. So they don't have the capacity to really have consciousness or reflective capacity like you or I have it. They don't care if they do something wrong because they only care about themselves. And B, they really don't know. Because there's like a wall between, they can't reflect on themselves. They can't say, you know what? When I kicked Nadine down the stairs, God, that must have really impacted her. Because when I said to my ex-husband, you know, that really hurt when you were a drug addict and you kicked me down the stairs. And he was like, get over it. It wasn't that bad. Right there, that shows no capacity for consciousness. So again, it's not just what they do, but it's their justification for it, right? That callousness, that insensitivity that doesn't allow them to bond.
Do you believe that they don't feel that because they are not capable of it, that they are born without a conscience? Because my experience tells me that they choose not to consult that system within him. And one of the things that I noticed from my own journey of betterment was that it's actually a choice whether or not you listen to that little voice. And the more you ignore it, the smaller and smaller and smaller it gets. But I had plenty of situations where I negotiated with those parts of my father, where I tried him to come into my shoes and see, for example, what emotional abuse does to a person. And that worked in a way. To a certain degree.
He could do it, yeah. Well, I mean,
do you believe evil is treatable? That was my
yes, I do.
setup.
I do believe that. I do, but I mean, there's a lot of research that psychopathy, you know, which first was in the 1880s, but then it was in 1940 and then 1985. Psychopathy is a lot more genetic. But I think personality disorders, especially cluster B personality disorders like borderline antisocial personality or narcissistic personality disorder, I think there is a genetic predisposition, but then environmental factors. So I do think that, anybody can change if they want to. They have to want to. But let's think about it this way. If you're getting a lot of rewards from being a psychopath, why are you going to change?
That was one of the things that struck me, was that before I know that story from you, like I took Belfort as a role model on how I wanted to sell, right? That was strange to me, that I was looking up to somebody where I didn't even know what kind of person it was. It was very, very, very strange to me in that regard. I wanted to ask you another question.
But that's not that strange, because you have to remember, he's an agentic narcissist. So he's a great leader. He's charming. He's charismatic. You know, nobody's all good or all bad. Like, he has good qualities to him, right? Right. And so those are the good qualities. He's just not using them for the light force. He's using them for the Darth Vader force. Well, back then he was anyway.
That's a beautiful, and that's Jung, right? It's like the integration of the shadow. And one of my favorite quotes from Solzhenitsyn was that everybody oscillates between good and evil. And there's a great documentary that I can recommend to anybody. It's about a serial killer called Robert Kolinsky, aka the Iceman. And there was a particular scene, like he killed like 100 people for the Boston mob. And there was one scene in that documentary where the serial killer asked the psychiatrist who was interviewing him what he'd think of him. And the psychiatrist told him basically, I feel pity for you and I'm sad because there are certain situations where your skill set could have been used for benevolent factors, such as you could have become a fighter pilot, you could have become a policeman, you could have hunted the bad guys, right? There was a choice. And that moment they switched the camera to Kolinsky, and he was like, he never thought of that. He thought he was doomed from the start. He had this victim's mentality. And that very little moment, I got fractured. And that was
Yes.
interesting. Do you believe we can like use our dark traits for light purposes in that regard?
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
I do, because I'll give you a personal example. So I was in therapy a few years ago with a really good therapist, and I was talking about something, and I said, "Well, I can't do that. That sounds like I'd have way too much power." And I think she goes, "Well, what do you think power is?" I'm like, "Bad, greedy." And she said, "Nadine, you have a white magic. I think I forgot what it was." She goes, "Your power can be used for good."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Really?"
Yeah.
That was like an awakening, because I didn't associate power with goodness. This was like 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget that. I was like, "Oh, okay." So, I mean, that power is the ability to influence somebody.
Yeah.
And it can be used for good.
Particularly as a therapist, that was one of the things that surprised me is sales, for example. When you talk somebody out of addiction, is what you do with them is you sell them on the idea that other
It's
coping mechanisms are superior to that, right? Or you can talk somebody off of suicide. It's Viktor Frankl used to do that all the time. It's like he would use transformative questions. Like a person would tell him, "I have nothing to expect out of life anymore." He would swap and say, "Could it not be that life is expecting something out of you?" It's question-based
Right.
selling used in a therapy room.
Yeah. Like we
Yeah.
call that motivational interviewing. Yeah.
Yeah, or you
Yeah.
today, like you had a session right before we jumped on a
Yeah.
call, and
Uh-huh.
it's the ability to switch. That's a
Yes.
little bit of I wouldn't call it psychopathic, but it's the ability to shut off and control your
Yeah.
emotions is something
Yeah.
that can be
And
used for good.
I would call that stress immunity,
Yeah.
which is a quality of being a psychopath.
I think I studied too much psychopathic literature. For me, everything is in the wrong book right
No,
now. I
that's
have
fine.
to watch my language.
It's
Yeah.
fine.
Okay. Last part of the interview, I would because it was important for me that we don't only make this about your marriage, because I assume that lots of your interviews have been about that chapter of your life.
Yeah.
But what I'm more interested in is the chapter that comes afterward, you being a therapist. So I wanted to ask you right away, what's the most meaningful case that you had in your life? Anything that pops to mind where you think about it?
They're all so meaningful, honestly. Every moment that I'm into being a therapist is meaningful. Yeah, too many to mention. But the way I look at therapy is that I'm a facilitator of their process. So they always had it in them, like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, right? She always had the red shoes. And that's the goal. That's the gift, that it's not about me. Somebody shows up.
Yeah.
I have the tapestry of theory, but I'm facilitating what was in them already. And that's just so beautiful, no matter who you're working with, to see that become born.
Yeah, for me, my counseling sessions have been somewhat therapeutic for myself, because
of course,
not having you as the focus point of the end all. And it's like, this is not about you, it's about them, and when they succeed, it's their success, not yours. It's so therapeutic in its essence.
So therapeutic.
I believe that our clients are also our biggest teachers. Any story that comes to mind where a client of yours helped you to become a better person, Nadine?
Oh God, every day. I mean, as you know, as a therapist, I always say we're living parallel lives. I mean, I could be going through an issue with my husband, and then my patient shows up with the same issue. And that's what I love, is that we're all human. And like you said, we all have light and shadow. And they all teach me every single day, in their courage and their bravery to show up, and their believing in themselves when everything tells them not to. They inspire me every day, because life is hard.
That's one of the strange things you learn, is that every week somebody comes and they tell you first about that call where somebody died, or that diagnosis, or that they got fired or something. So you are, at least it did for me, is to become more grateful of all catastrophe-free moments of life in a way.
Yeah, and I think, when I went through a lot in my life. I had breast cancer, and my crazy husband, I had a movie made about my life. My mom died when I was 31, and I was always like, why am I going through so much, like so young, And then every day I'd be going down to my office. I'd be like, oh, that's why I went through that. That's why I went through that. Because aside from my professional experience, I've been through a lot of trauma personally. So it allows me to have a different type of empathy. Mm-hmm. Because experience is the best teacher.
Yeah, the most brutal teacher also.
The most brutal, but it's the best. So that's why this happened. That's why that happened. And so that also gives meaning to the suffering.
Yeah. I want to ask you, is it okay if we have 3 more questions before I shut up and let you alone? Mm-hmm. Wonderful. One of the problems that I wanted to solve with this call was not only to find out a little bit more about how you became the person that you are today, but also provide people who were in the situation that you have been, with your ex-husband, with a little bit of a awakening kit or something that we can give them on the way to help them.
Yeah.
What would you give them?
I think that if you're in a toxic relationship, and listen, there's a difference between normal couple fighting and a relationship where you feel like you're being coercively controlled, where you're being manipulated or belittled or isolated or dominated or threatened. And if you are feeling like that, don't ignore it. Trust that little voice inside, and go to therapy and explore really what's happening. Because everybody has a turning point. Everybody has a moment where they wake up. Sometimes you can emotionally detach. Sometimes you feel physically or emotionally unsafe. Sometimes you actually go out and get a job and really develop a stronger sense of self to allow you to separate from the situation. So however that wake up comes to you, or if it doesn't happen and you need to go out and get help to have that wake up happen, go do it. You're worth it.
Going back to Jung believed that the most important question we should all ask ourselves is, what myth am I living? I love that.
Yeah. I love that too. I know what myth I was living. I've already written a thesis about it. I was upset. I mean, I was completely living the myth of Persephone and Demeter.
Tell me that again, please.
Where Persephone goes into the underworld, but then she comes out, and she becomes queen of the underworld, but then she goes out. She bites the pomegranate and has to stay in hell with Hades. I was in the underworld.
What would you, if you could talk to yourself in the moment where you were down there in the abyss, in the world of the archetypes, what message would you tell yourself?
I would say to myself, don't give up. Just keep going, and the only way is through. And that what my second husband said to me when I first met him, he said, don't worry, cream rises to the top.
I love that. Shout out to you and your husband. I love that. Absolutely. Okay, last question. If you would die, you would stand at the gates of heaven, what would you like to see or hear?
My mother's voice.
Let's leave it like that.
Yeah.
Nadine, I'm beyond grateful that you took the time out of your extremely busy schedule to appear on the Psychology Podcast. Where can people find you? How can we all, the listeners and myself, support you on the mission of making the world a more trauma-free place?
That's right. Thank you. Okay, so my Instagram handle is Dr. Nae, DRNAE, LMFT. And then my website is Nadine Macaluso. I married a crazy Sicilian, MACALUSO.com.
Okay. I will put everything in the show notes. I forgot.
Perfect.
I will put everything in the show notes. And guys, for everybody who listened, I highly recommend that you check out Dr. Nadine Macaluso's website. There's great stuff in there. I also like the other products that you promote there. And it's obvious that you are currently driven by helping as many individuals as possible to live their best life. And I admire you for that. And I'm grateful that people like you exist, and you motivate me to become better. And any advice on who I should interview next before I let you go?
Oh God, that's a good question. Think about that. You know, there's a very good therapist that I know very well. Her name is Dr. Shirley, Shirley, and her last name is Impilezzi, Impilezeri. She's a great doctor in Beverly Hills.
I would love that. I will give her an
And
invite.
yeah, and tell her that that I referred you. She's lovely. We did the neuroaffective relational model training together, and she's trained in everything. She's been doing this forever.
I love these people who have so long credentials. Just talk to her.
Yeah, and she's also very spiritual. And she does a podcast with a psychic, and she's a lot of fun.
Okay.
But if you just Google her and put in Beverly Hills, she'll come up.
Wonderful. To all the listeners, thank you for tuning in. See you in the next episode.
Take care. Thank you.